Hey everybody, welcome back to IC 109 podcast.
You're at 109 right now.
Ladies and gentlemen, I'm continuing with this Black History Month 2025 theme of reading about California's Black history. To that end, I am reading California's Black Pioneers, a brief historical survey by Kenneth G. Goode, the late Kenneth G. Goode. This book was written in the 1970s, copywritten in 1974, I believe. This book, I think it was printed in 74. It was written in 73. Well, I don't know exactly when it was written, but you get the idea. So now I'm going to continue, all right, with chapter 3. Basically, this book is composed of essays. So this is the third essay. This essay is entitled United States Conquest of California. Let's get into it, shall we? The United States had an interest in California long before the appearance of the first permanent American settlers in the territory. After the Revolutionary War, there was a tremendous development of American commerce, pursuing fortunes. New England whalers and merchant ships penetrated the most remote corners of the North and South Pacific. Eventually, such voyages brought these vessels to the harbors of the California coast, where they began an extensive, though illegal, trade centering initially around the sea otter. Because this trade helped lay the foundations for the development of friendly relations with China, the U.S. government began to develop an interest in the territory along the Pacific coast. Furthermore, this contraband trade began to provide a very large portion of the raw hide and tallow used in New England's extensive leather and candle industry. Thus, the hide and tallow trade came to be a powerful factor in arousing the interest of the United States in California. Just as the acquisition of California was part of the settlement of the Mexican War, the early negotiations for its purchase were inextricably interwoven with the annexation of Texas. In 1835, Anthony Butler, United States, this is a French term here, ladies and gentlemen, charge d'affaires, charge d'affaires, it's a French term, in Mexico, suggested to President Andrew Jackson that $500,000 judiciously applied could secure the purchase of Texas, New Mexico, and Upper and Lower California. After 6 years without result, Jackson denounced Butler as an unprincipled diplomat and ousted him from his position. However, Jackson subsequently made two efforts to purchase the area surrounding San Francisco Bay, and when discussing the question of mediation between Mexico and Texas with Mexican General Santa Anna after the Battle of San Jacinto, he offered Mexico $3.5 million for the northern part of California. At about the same time, Jackson urged the new Republic of Texas to extend its borders to include California. Such a move, he reasoned, would assure American control of the finest harbor on the Pacific coast and thereby satisfy commercial interest in the North regarding the annexation of Texas. In 1842, an incident occurred which clearly showed United States' intention to secure California. Acting under an erroneous report that war had been declared between the United States and Mexico, and that Mexico intended to cede California to England, Commodore Thomas Ap Catesby John Jones commander of the Pacific Squadron, who had been sent to the West Coast to watch the movements of English and French vessels, sailed from Callao, Peru, to Monterrey, where he formally demanded the surrender of the port. He set a landing force ashore to occupy the city, issued a proclamation to the inhabitants, and on October 20th, 1842, raised the American flag over the government house of Monterrey. However, 2 days later, he restored Monterrey to Mexico, having been convinced that he had been misinformed. This incident compelled President John Tyler to suspend the negotiations for the purchase of California, but it did show that the United States did not intend to be forestalled by any European nation in the acquisition of California. As time passed, a number of Americans openly and vociferously advocated the acquisition of California. Waddy Thompson, United States Minister to Mexico, indicated that the territory was the richest, healthiest, and most beautiful in the world, and because of its agricultural, political, commercial, industrial, and fishing potential, the importance of acquisition could not be overestimated. Daniel Webster, Secretary of State during the first years of Tyler's administration, was also a strong advocate of annexation. Considering the San Francisco Bay 20 times more valuable than the whole of Texas, he proposed a tripartite agreement under which the United States would acquire California. The claims of Americans against Mexico would be satisfied, and the Oregon boundary dispute between England and the United States would be settled. Although the plan was politically feasible, it did not arouse sufficient interest to reach the negotiation stage. In 1843, John C. Calhoun replaced Webster as Secretary of State and continued to press for the immediate annexation of California. According to official and unofficial reports, California was inhabited by few Californians. The territorial government was ready to disintegrate. Mexico's hold on the territory was weak and ineffective, and the military defenses were totally inadequate. Moreover, Russia, Prussia, France, and England, by word or deed, or both, had expressed interest in the acquisition of California. In addition, a vocal segment of Americans and Native Californians were advocating independence for the territory. In response to these pressures, President Tyler in 1843 appointed Thomas O. Larkin, a merchant in Monterey and an active promoter of American immigration to California, to serve as American consul in California. Larkin was to gather fact and rumor on everything that took place in California and make reports to the State Department. Recognizing Larkin's importance in the effort to acquire California, President James Buchanan, in October 1845, appointed him a confidential agent of the State Department, instructing him to lay plans for the peaceful acquisition of California and to encourage Californians to look to the United States for counsel and assistance. Larkin immediately began to carry out this mission by enlisting some of the most influential Americans and Californians, including Mariano Guadalupe Vallejo, General Jose Castro, author of a plan that called for the independence of California in 1847 to 1848, Jacob P. Leese, or Jacob P. Leese, J.J. Warner, and Abel Stearns. President James K. Polk, a Jacksonian nationalist and a strong advocate of manifest destiny, a racist, excuse me, that's not in the book, but that's what they're saying, was elected in November 1844 on an expansionist platform that called not only for the acquisition of Texas and the settlement of the Oregon boundary dispute with England, but also the annexation of California, encouraging Polk to act where were reports of British persistence. Mexican President Santa Anna and the English minister to Mexico were negotiating for the purchase of California. The British Hudson's Bay Company had furnished the Californians with arms to expel the Mexican governor, Miquel Torena. British presidents held a mortgage on Alta and Baja California. The British fleet had been reinforced for the purpose of taking California in case of war between the United States and Mexico. Polk sent John Slidell to Mexico to negotiate the purchase of California, authorizing him to offer as much as $25 million for the territory. Slidell encountered strong anti American sentiment, however, and the mission failed. If California could not be purchased, three alternatives were available: an armed revolt instigated by those who would seek admission into the Union, long term colonization by Americans who would eventually seek independence from Mexico and admission into the Union, and forcible seizure by war. On April 25th, 1846, Mexican forces entered disputed territory between the Nueces and the Rio Grande rivers, which the United States claimed as a result of the Texas Revolt. Interpreting this action as an invasion, the United States government officially declared war against Mexico on May 12th, 1846. Thus, the third alternative became a reality. A year earlier, Major John C. Fremont, aware that a war with Mexico was imminent, left St. Louis on his third scientific expedition to California, arriving at Sutter's Fort in January 1846. After discussions with U.S. Consul Larkin in Monterey and Vice Consul William A. Leidsdorf in San Francisco, Fremont was detained by the Mexican comandante of the Monterey garrison, who was suspicious of Fremont's motives for being in California. Convincing the comandante that the expedition was a peaceful one, Fremont was granted permission to remain. In early March 1846, after joining his main force in the Santa Clara Valley, Fremont, abandoning the pretext of the scientific expedition, journeyed to Hawks Peak, some 25 miles from Monterey, where his men quickly built a fort overlooking the Salinas Valley. Raising the American flag over the fort, he appeared to make it clear that he intended to stay indefinitely. However, upon learning that the Mexican comandante was planning his removal and heeding the urging of Consul Larkin, Fremont decided to move his party into Oregon. On the way north, he was overtaken by a courier from Washington, Archibald H. Gillespie, who gave him a package of confidential messages prompting Fremont to turn back. Camping at Marysville Buttes, about 60 miles north of Sutter's Fort, Fremont's forces quickly began to attract Americans who were excited about the rumors of the approaching war between the United States and Mexico. In early June 1846, some of Fremont's followers learned that a large band of horses was to be delivered to the Mexican officials. Fearing that the horses might be used in an effort to force the Americans' removal from California, the Americans intercepted the delivery and had the horses driven to Fremont's camp. Several days later, the group, now joined by other Americans, invaded the home of Mariano G. Vallejo, a wealthy native Californian whom Larkin had counted on to implement his plan of peaceful annexation. The Americans unlawfully placed Vallejo under arrest and forced him to sign the Articles of Surrender. They quickly improvised a red and white flag depicting a grizzly bear facing a red star and raised it in the plaza at Sonoma. Thus was born on June 14th, 1846, the California Bear Flag Republic. A proclamation signed by William B. Ide, one of the flag raising party, asserted that the aim of the revolt was to set up a republican government in place of the oppressive, despotic military government which existed in the territory. Californians were guaranteed life, liberty, and property and were asked to assist in establishing a republican government. The Bear Flag the Bear Flag Republic was short-lived. However, for on July 7th, 1846, United States naval forces under Commodore John D. Sloat captured Monterey and officially raised the American flag as Sonoma. Sloat also issued a proclamation that was less conciliatory than Ide's, in which he stated unequivocally that henceforth California will be a portion of the United States, and that even though he came in arms, he did not come as an enemy but a friend, and that the civil rights of conscience, property, and suffrage would be respected. He also stated that any person who did not wish to live under the new government could leave the territory and that all public officials could retain their offices and continue to exercise their functions. Arriving in Monterey in mid July 1846, Commodore Robert F. Stockton replaced Sloat as Commander in Chief of Military and Naval Forces and Governor of California. Issuing two proclamations within several days, Stockton, California, you dig? Robert F. Stockton. Stockton accused Jose Castro, the commander in chief of California's military forces, of committing atrocities against the Fremont forces and asserted that he would make war upon all those who opposed the authority of the United States. He indicated that all those who acknowledged the authority of the United States would be treated as citizens of the United States, and that as soon as possible the territory would be governed under laws similar to those of other U.S. territories. He decreed that the chief executive would be governor, commander in chief of the army, and superintendent of Indian affairs. He would also approve laws passed by a legislative council, grant administrative pardons, and commission military officers. Public officials were to be elected, or the governor would appoint persons to fill them. However, Stockton was not able to implement immediately his decrees, for on the night of September 29th, 1846, news arrived that Southern Californians had revolted and that the American garrison at Los Angeles was under siege. A few military skirmishes followed, one at San Pascual between the Californians under Jose Antonio Carrillo and the forces of General Stephen W. Kearny, who had been instructed by the Secretary of War to take New Mexico and then march to California, claim possession of it, and establish a civil government. The Californians surrendered to Fremont on January 12, 1847, at Rancho de Cahuenga, near San Fernando. On January 13th, the Treaty of Cahuenga was signed by the mulatto Andres Pico, Comandante of Squadron and Chief of the National Forces of California, and Major John C. Fremont, Military Commandant of California. Under the treaty, Under the treaty's terms, the Californians would surrender their entire force to Fremont, give up their arms, and return peaceably to their homes, and conform to the laws of the United States. Fremont, in turn, agreed, pending a peace treaty between the United States and Mexico, that any Californian who so desired could leave the territory, and every citizen of California would enjoy the same privileges and rights as those enjoyed by citizens of the United States. With the signing of the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo on February 2nd, 1848, the war between the United States and Mexico formally came to an end. Under this treaty, the United States acquired all of Alta California, as well as New Mexico and Texas, and agreed to pay Mexico the token sum of $15 million. Many blacks took part in the conquest of California, some in prominent roles. U.S. forces included Army regulars, trappers, settlers, half breeds, and even a few Delaware Indians, with blacks represented in at least the first three categories and possibly the fourth. Jacob Dodson was a free Afro American who accompanied Fremont on his California expeditions and was present at the surrender of Andres Pico, himself a mulatto and brother of former Governor Pio Pico. A black man named Ben was the body servant of Lieutenant Archibald H. Gillespie, like Dizzy Gillespie, who was in command of the Los Angeles garrison. The party of Americans that seized Sonoma and arrested General Vallejo included several Afro Americans, among them John Grider, who provided the paint used to color the California Republic flag. The other blacks in the Bear Flag Party were Joe McAfee, Charles G. Gaines, and Billy Gaston. After the peace treaty was signed, Americans in California were hopeful that the U.S. government would immediately recognize California as a state or territory. Unfortunately, a territorial government was not immediately forthcoming because Congress adjourned in August 1848 without taking any action. The following year, Congress once more adjourned, again, leaving the political future of California undecided. In the meantime, public sentiment for a territorial government had greatly increased. California's military governor, General Bennett Riley, who had assumed office on April 13th, 1849, issued a proclamation on June 3rd, 1849, calling for an election of delegates who would draft a constitution and establish a state or territorial government. Out of the 48 delegates elected to the convention, which commenced on September 1st at Monterey, seven native Californians participated, including the mulatto Antonio Maria Pico, former prefect, alcalde, and legislator from San Jose. 15 delegates were whites who had come from southern slave states. After deciding to proceed with the drafting of a state constitution rather than organize as a territory, the Committee on Constitution drew up a Declaration of Rights. A section was added stating that neither slavery nor involuntary servitude, unless for the punishment of crimes, would be tolerated in California. Despite the pro slavery Southerners, this proposal was adopted unanimously and almost without debate. Shortly after the adoption of this section of the Declaration of Rights, a second edition was proposed, which would require the state legislature at its first session to pass a law prohibiting free blacks from migrating to and settling in California. This section would also make it illegal for slave owners to bring their slaves into the state to set them free. Some delegates, especially those representing the mining interests, believed that slave owners migrating to California would bring their slaves to work in the mine fields and eventually liberate them. These ex slaves would then become wards of the state and a financial burden on the white citizens of California. In support of his resolution, McCarver, a farmer from the Sacramento district and formerly a member of the Oregon legislature, told the committee that the presence of free blacks in California would be repugnant to the feelings of the people and injurious to the prosperity of the community. Blacks were, he added, idle in their habits, difficult to be governed by the laws, thriftless, and uneducated. Convention President Dr. Robert Semple, a Kentuckian who had been a leader of the Bear Flag Revolt, echoed McCarver's sentiments and said that all of his constituents approved the exclusion of blacks, thousands of blacks. he warned, would migrate to California if the exclusionary provision was not adopted. In God's name, Simple pleaded, let us make California a place where free white men can live. The country was rich, he told the delegates. Thousands of intelligent and enterprising white men had poured into the country to labor in gold mines. But bring in Negro labor in competition with them, and you will soon see the disastrous result. You degrade the white you degrade white labor. Let us keep our institutions pure. Let us elevate society here to the highest degree that can possibly be attained by man. Dr. O. M. Wozencraft, a physician from the San Joaquin district, declared that the free Negro was one of the greatest evils with which society could be afflicted, and thus, he explained, his wish to exclude Negroes sprang from philanthropic motives. It was better for the race. Kimball H. Dimmick, ex captain in an Army battalion that had come to California during the war with Mexico, while stating that he had no partiality for the Negro race and that he had the same personal antipathies toward Negroes which other delegates avowed, wanted the delegates to act consistently. He asked, what will be said? What will be said of our Constitution if we assert one thing in our Bill of Rights and then in another exclude a class speaking our own language, born and brought up in the United States, acquainted with our customs, and calculated to make useful citizens? John McDougall, who had lived in Ohio and Indiana and was a merchant in Sacramento, offered a substitute resolution which would admit blacks who were citizens of other states and exclude only those who were slaves or who were brought to California under indenture. William Shannon, a lawyer from the Sacramento district who had introduced the provision which prohibited slavery, said that as a New York lawyer, he was acquainted with respectable black citizens, some of whom were both wealthy and intelligent, and therefore he could not support the McCarver resolution. However, he could support McDougall's proposition, which would admit free Negroes who had been citizens of other states. Edward Gilbert of the San Francisco district admittedly had no fanatical fondness for blacks because his whole education made them repugnant to him, but he vigorously opposed the McCarver resolution because he felt that such a provision of or anything like it would violate the principles of liberal and enlightened freedom, as well as the provision in the U.S. Constitution, which stated that the citizens of each state shall be entitled to all the privileges and immunities of citizens in the several states. He did not believe, he told the convention, that the majority of the people in California wished to exclude blacks, and furthermore, that a state constitution with such a provision would not be approved by the U.S. Congress. Immediately after Gilbert's lengthy speech, Charles T. Botts, a lawyer and magazine editor from Virginia, asked for a vote, which the committee took over several objections, and McCarver's proposition was adopted. It stated that the legislature shall, at its first session, pass such laws as will effectually prohibit free persons of color from immigrating to and settling in this state, and to effectually prevent the owners of slaves from bringing them into this state for the purposes of setting them free. When the report of the Constitutional Committee was taken up by the convention, it was pointed out by Myron Norton, a representative from the San Francisco district, that when Missouri applied for admission to the Union with such a clause in its constitution, Congress required that it be deleted. Again, there was much discussion, but this time the provision was rejected 31 to 8. Efforts to prohibit the entry of blacks into California continued. In his opening address to the state's first legislature on December 21st, 1849, Governor P.H. Burnett requested passage of a law that would prevent blacks from entering California. Brought up in a slave state and having accumulated a substantial fortune through ownership of plantations, Burnett disliked the presence of free blacks and was firmly convinced that they should not be admitted into California. As a legislator in Oregon in 1844, he had introduced a provision prohibiting free blacks from entering that state and expelling those who were already there, an act subsequently incorporated into Oregon's constitution. In California, his position was that if Californians prohibited slavery, they should also exclude free blacks. He argued that California's commercial and mineral resources would bring thousands of free blacks, and if they were permitted to come to California, they would work cheaply in direct competition with white laborers and inevitably become enemies of society and the state government. He further declared that a state had the right to prevent immigration of any class of persons considered injurious to its inhabitants. Legislation incorporating such racial discrimination was introduced at the 1850 and 1851 state legislative sessions, but the bills were never passed, thanks primarily to the persistent efforts of Senator David L. Broderick, a long-standing friend of blacks and champion of human rights who was unalterably opposed to the institution of slavery. On November 13, 1849, the California Constitution was ratified almost unanimously by the white male voters in the territory. Immediately after organizing, the first state legislature named two U.S. senators who immediately departed for Washington, D.C. to present to Congress for its approval the new state constitution and petition for admission into the Union. The question as to whether California would be admitted into the Union as a free or slave state was raised initially in August 1846, when Representative David Wilmot of Pennsylvania introduced an amendment to a bill appropriating money to purchase land acquired as a result of the Mexican War, called the Wilmot Proviso. The amendment would have prohibited slavery in all territory which the United States secured from Mexico. Although this measure passed the House of Representatives, it twice failed to win approval in the Senate because of the opposition of Southern senators who were determined to maintain a numerical balance of senators from slave and free states. By 1850, there were three divergent points of view being expressed in Congress with regard to the admission of California. One, the line of the Missouri Compromise, 36 degrees, 30, I don't know how to read that, 30 feet, 36 degrees, 30 feet, should be extended to the Pacific Ocean, and those states above the line should be free, and those below the line slave. The entire territory acquired, two, second, the entire territory acquired from Mexico should be slave. And three, the entire territory should be free. With the country now strongly divided over the slave issue, threats of secession, and the situation in California demanding a speedy settlement, Congress convened in early December 1849. President Zachary Taylor, in his first annual message, reported that the people of California, out of necessity, had adopted a constitution and will soon apply for admission into the Union. He said that if the state constitution conformed to the Constitution of the United States, the application should be favorably considered without interjecting sectional issues. The president's introduction of the issue was followed by much formal and informal discussion. The critical question was a sectional one, whether California would be admitted as a slave state or free state. Senator Thomas Hart Benton, John C. Fremont's father in law, argued forcefully that California had washed her hands of slavery with the inclusion of an anti slavery provision in its constitution, and therefore Congress had no right to dictate other terms of admission. Furthermore, Benton declared California's admission into the Union should not be dependent upon the resolution of other issues, such as the creation of a territorial government in New Mexico, the admission of Texas, the suppression of the slave trade in Washington, D.C., or the return of fugitive slaves. A seriously ill senator, John C. Calhoun, the South's leading spokesman, who at a meeting with California Senator elect William M. Gwynn had predicted that the admission of California as a free state would result in civil war, presented on March 4th, 1850, his last great speech in the Senate. Rising painfully to address the chairman, the South Carolinian announced that because of physical weakness, he was unable to deliver the argument he had prepared. He then asked Senator James M. Mason of Virginia to read the address. In this speech, Calhoun strongly opposed the admission of California as a free state and argued that it should be remanded to territorial status because the citizens of California, in adopting a constitution without having been instructed to do so by Congress, acted in defiance of the authority of Congress. What they had done, he said, was revolutionary and rebellious in its character and anarchical in its tendency. Calhoun insisted that if the Union were to be preserved, the North must recognize the equal rights of the South in all the recently acquired territory. The North must return fugitive slaves and cease their agitation of the question of slavery. He looked upon the effort to admit California as a scheme to weaken the South and increase the coercive power of the North. Calhoun insisted that disunion was the only alternative left if the North continued to increase its ascendancy over the South, and he charged that the responsibility of saving the Union rests on the North and not the South. If you, who represent the stronger portion, cannot agree to settle them, the great questions at issue, on the broad principle of justice and duty, say so. And let the states we both represent agree to separate and part in peace. If you are unwilling, we should part in peace. Tell us so, and we shall know what to do when you reduce the question to submission or resistance. If you remain silent, you will compel us to infer by your actions that you intend. If you remain silent, you will compel us to infer by your acts what you intend. In this case, California will become the question. In the emotional atmosphere, Calhoun's speech had created, Senator Daniel Webster of Massachusetts attempted to answer Calhoun's charges. In the emotional atmosphere Calhoun's speech had created, Senator Daniel Webster of Massachusetts attempted to answer Calhoun's charges. Following an eloquent discussion of California's history and the constitutionality of application for statehood, Webster declared that the exclusion of slavery from California and New Mexico was ordained by a law even superior to that which admits and sanctions it in Texas. I mean the law of nature, of physical geography, the law of the formation of the earth. The law settles forever with a strength beyond all terms of human enactment that slavery cannot exist in California or New Mexico. On March 12, 1850, at President Taylor's urging, California Representatives George W. Wright and Edward Gilbert and Senators elect William M. Gwynn and John C. Fremont issued a joint statement to the Senate and House Representatives. In the statement, the delegation expressed surprise at the organized opposition to admission and said that the people of California were not rebels, usurpers, nor anarchists, did not expect that their admission as a state would be made the test question upon which would hang the preservation of the American Union. They asked that the citizens of California be permitted to reap the common benefits, share the common ills, and promote the common welfare as one of the United States of America. It is difficult to determine what influence this statement had upon Congress, but taken with other events, it probably hastened the admission of California. Factors that contributed heavily to the outcome were the death of John C. Calhoun on March 31st, the adjournment of the Nashville Convention without having taken steps to dissolve the Union, the death of President Taylor on July 9th, and the secession of Millard Fillmore, who did much to ease the tension between North and South congressional factions. The decision to deal with each sectional issue separately rather than attempt to incorporate all issues in one omnibus bill. Admission did not come, however, before numerous speeches and motions were made in both houses of Congress seeking to delay the admission or divide the state in two. It was not until September 9, 1850, under the open threat of Americans in California to declare their independence and set up a separate republic, that a bill, one of several included in the Compromise of 1850, was finally passed, formally admitting California into the Union as a free state. Immediately following California's admission, a protest signed by 10 Southern senators, including the future president of the Confederacy, Jefferson Davis, was submitted to the Secretary of the Senate. The Southerners expressed extreme displeasure at California's admission as a free state. The protest was read on the Senate floor and recorded in the Senate Journal over the objections of a number of senators in an effort to reduce factionalism and avoid further argument by dissolving the Union. Even with California's admission as a free state, Southern hopes of changing California's status to a slave state did not die. While admission was being debated in Washington, a group of Southern Californians against free state status held meetings in Los Angeles on February 10th and March 3rd, 1850, to get signatures for a petition opposing the adopted plan of admission with its proposed boundaries and advocating instead a separate territory or state of the southern part of California. The petition, addressed to the Congress of the United States, was signed by many Los Angeles residents. Similar resolutions were passed in San Luis Obispo, San Diego, and Santa Barbara. A group of planters from the southern states presented a petition to the California legislature requesting special permission to bring their slaves to California to farm. It was suggested that slaves be used to clear and develop certain land in the state because too many whites were being afflicted by poison oak. In 1854, when pro Southerners became a powerful force in the state legislature, DuBose Review, the Southern Planter Journal, reported that there was a strong possibility that the southern half of California would become a separate state with its own constitution recognizing and establishing slavery. The division movement in California was also discussed in newspapers in the East, where some people were advocating the acquisition of more territory for slavery from Cuba, portions of Mexico, and Southern California. Some news periodicals indicated that plans were being developed to incite a revolt in Sonora, Mexico, or Baja California, with the idea of linking one or both of these areas with the southern portion of California in order to form a new slave state on the Pacific coast. The question of dividing California was argued both inside the state legislature and by the people themselves until the late 1850s and early 1860s, when the issues that culminated in civil war became the primary concern of citizens throughout the nation. After the Civil War, with slavery no longer an issue, other grounds for division arose. They were unfair taxation, unfair representation in state government, industrial and commercial differences, dissimilarity of the people, and geographical differences. In 1859, Andres Pico had secured legislative approval for the incorporation of the counties from San Luis Obispo south as the territory of Colorado. A two-thirds vote of approval in the affected counties seemed assured, but before congressional approval could be gained, the Civil War broke out and blocked the attempt to bisect California. You're listening to IC 109. I just read the third essay in California's Black Pioneers, a brief historical survey by Kenneth G. Goode.
You're at 109 right now.